Dr. Brian Taylor. He's the Director of Clinical Content Development for Signia. He's also the editor of Audiology Practices. It's a quarterly journal of the Academy of Doctors of Audiology. Editor at large for Hearing Health and Technology Matters, and an adjunct professor at the University of Wisconsin. Brian's authored several peer-reviewed articles and textbooks and is a highly sought-after lecturer, and we certainly realize that, and how fortunate we are to be able to get you with us today. So he has over 30 years of experience as both a clinician, business manager, and university instructor. His most recent textbooks, Audiology Practice Management, was published in 2019, and the third edition of his Selecting and Fitting Hearing Aids was published in 2020. So thanks so much for your time and expertise, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks for the nice introduction. It's really great to be with you. This is the third talk I've given today at a state meeting.
Wow.
And it's the great thing about this technology. It's better always, of course, to be face-to-face, but you know, you can be in many places on the same day when you have a computer in your office and the internet. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I have 1 hour to talk about subclinical hearing loss and what clinicians need to know. And I hope that you can walk away from the presentation with a few things that you can start using in your practice on Monday morning. No need to get into that because of Sandy's nice introduction. What I'll do over the next hour, the two main points I want to get across to you today is that subclinical hearing loss, there are a lot of people out there that have this, and it's an underserved population. And the other thing is I want to get across to you is customizable hearing aids that look more like consumer audio products is just one of many tools that you should have in your intervention toolbox. It's by no means the only tool. You may not take it out of your toolbox all that often, but because of some of the really important changes in technology over the last few years, it is a tool that's available to you now, and I think it'll start to grow in importance. So more on that intervention toolbox and hybrid products in a little bit. Just so that we're grounded, I want to remind everybody that hearing technology for the last couple of decades has been incrementally improving in three important categories, or in three areas: connectivity, personalization, and what I call core signal processing. Let's do just a very quick review so that we're grounded on these terms. When we talk about core signal processing, I'm thinking about the workhorse, the engine of the hearing aid. It's what processes all sound all the time when a person's wearing their devices. And we won't get into the details today, but signal classifications systems inside of hearing aids are getting more and more dynamic, more and more complicated. They rely on many variables. One of the newer ones that's kind of interesting is motion detection, and that enables all kinds of smarter beam forming and noise. And of course, there's a lot of benefits that can be had for patients. When we talk about wireless connections, we're talking mainly, with all due respect to Juliet and T-coils, which obviously are an important part of your intervention toolbox. Or when we're talking about Bluetooth, we're talking about 2.4 gigahertz streaming. We're talking about low energy Bluetooth for remote control or the use of the app. And then when we talk about device-to-device communication, we're talking about near-field magnetic induction. Not things we're going to get into today. The point I want to make is that technology incrementally improves, in relation to Moore's law, and it's incredibly complicated what's under the hood of a hearing aid these days. Especially in this area of personalization, we're starting to see the emergence of neural networks and deep learning. Every company now is using artificial intelligence and machine learning, deep learning, and eventually I think these kinds of features inside of a hearing aid are going to allow more and more people to kind of self-fit their own device. That's a conversation for another day as well. even though the point I want to make now is even though the technology, and I think we would all agree from a performance standpoint, every year or two incrementally improves, it's kind of perplexing that the uptake of hearing aids has remained kind of the same for the last several decades. Here's one way to look at that. You can look at device ownership as a function of hearing loss. And I think a lot of you are familiar with this pyramid. It kind of shows you take all the Americans that have hearing loss, 75% of Americans that have hearing loss, or I should say 10% of Americans that have hearing loss are in that severe profound category. And of that 10%, 70% are hearing aid owners. Another 10% are cochlear implant recipients, and then another 10% are part of the deaf and signing community. So at the top of the pyramid, there's not much room to grow that market for obvious reasons, because those people are so completely that want to wear amplification or implants are really dependent on it day to day to function. If you look at the middle of the graph, we know that about 35% or so of Americans that have a hearing loss are in the moderate category, and about half of them are hearing aid owners. That leaves us with that bottom 55% of Americans with hearing loss are in the mild category, and only 10% of them are hearing aid owners. And that's not new information, and it's been this way for many years. And of course, people far smarter than me have tried to figure out why is it that only 10% of the population that are in the mild category are hearing aid owners. And the reason for non-use in that category is multifaceted. It's a lot of reasons. It's not just one or two. It's probably a combination of several factors. You see some of them listed here. Again, no surprise, the hearing aids are not worth the money. They don't meet expectations. They're uncomfortable. They can be expensive. People do well enough without the hearing aids. I want us to focus on the last couple: appearance, cosmetic concerns, and stigma. Those are design issues in some ways. If the hearing aid looked more maybe cooler, if it looked more like a fashion accessory, if it looked like AirPods, for example, maybe people would wear them more. We don't, that's a theory. I think there's some credibility to it. We really don't know for sure. But the bottom line is we know that for every 3 adults that have some hearing loss, just one of them is likely to be a hearing aid owner. It's a really small number. It hasn't changed, even though technology has incrementally improved in some phenomenal ways over the last decade or so. But here's the kicker. I don't know if you're a fan of JAWS or not, but you might be familiar with the phrase, they go out into the ocean to try to get the shark and they find out that they need a bigger boat. And the point I want to make is that the challenge for us to try to address the unmet or underserved needs of the market, that challenge is actually bigger than what that pyramid that I showed you a few minutes ago is telling us. And another way to look at that is for every problem that's out there, and the problem here is the underserved individuals out there with hearing loss and hearing difficulty, that for every problem, it's really an opportunity in disguise, as the second president of the United States said about 230 years ago. All right, so I want you now to kind of set aside your clinician hat for a few minutes and put on your business or your management hat for a second. I want to talk about how we can uncover new categories of individuals out there that could maybe benefit from something in our intervention toolbox. The famous saying around every problem, it doesn't need a hammer, whatever that is. There's a famous saying around every tool doesn't need to be a hammer. And that, what I want to talk about next kind of underscores that point. There are 2 different categories of individuals that you might see or that you might think about come in to see you. The vast majority of them are people that have measured hearing loss. We put them in the booth, we test them, and we find that their audiogram is worse than 20 or 25 dB. The pure tone average is worse than, let's say, 25 dB. We also know that there are people out there that have self-reported hearing difficulty. And it turns out some of them, maybe some people more than others, have normal audiograms. And of course, most people that have a measured hearing loss also report hearing difficulty. But there are some people out there that have normal audiograms and continue to self-report hearing difficulty. And when we define our target market out there by these two variables, measured hearing loss, as we see it on the audiogram, and self-reported hearing difficulty. A person says, I'm struggling in background noise. We can take those two independent variables and we can cross them and come up with a very handy 4-box or 4-quadrant matrix. And actually, Brent Edwards, who is now at the National Acoustic Laboratories, did all this hard work for us. So what I'm showing you here is something that he published about a year ago in Seminars in Hearing. It was part of the Market Track 10 studies that I'm thinking Tom Powers and Kate Carr talked about last night. I'm sorry I missed that because it's always worth hearing that. But all Brent did, like a good business manager, is he took those two variables and crossed them and came up with a 4-quadrant matrix. And when you do that, you can start to uncover some of the what different segments of the market might value, or what they might want us to do a little bit differently as an industry or as a profession. Notice horizontally along the top, we have no hearing loss as measured on the audiogram, and then we have measured hearing loss. Quadrant A is no hearing loss. Quadrant B is measured hearing loss. Then when you look vertically on the left margin, you see self-reported hearing difficulty. No hearing difficulty reported on the top, and self-reported hearing difficulty on the bottom. Let's go through each one of these 4 boxes and let's talk about who might fit inside. Box number A is the overwhelming majority of the adult population. It's people that have normal audiograms and don't report any problems. And of course, why do they need to know that you exist? Because they're not having any issues. They have no reason to see you. They have no reason to search out hearing aids or any kind of amplification device online. That, of course, that need can change over the next decade or so. So maybe it's important to educate Quadrant A about the importance of protecting their hearing, or maybe getting a baseline hearing test. But the bottom line is Quadrant A really has no rational, no reason to want to see us or know that we exist. If we move over to Quadrant B, those are individuals that have a measured hearing loss. And of course, it could be a quite sizable hearing loss. It could be a moderate, a severe hearing loss, but they're not self-reporting any hearing difficulty. We see these patients all of the time. Patients that are in Quadrant B, in my opinion, are patients that might say, it's not bad enough yet. I get by. I don't think I have a problem. My wife says I have a problem. I just turn up the television. You hear those kinds of stories all the time in your clinic. I would argue that those are patients that really, many of them belong in Quadrant B. If we move down, let's move into the bottom right quadrant, D and E. Those are people that have a self-reported hearing difficulty and a measured hearing loss. And of course, as you would expect, many of them are currently hearing aid owners. And then the other half or so are not. They're people that maybe they don't want to bother to come into the office, even though they know they need it, and they say, yes, I'm having difficulty, but they cost too much. I don't like the way they look. I got to make a lot of appointments. I'm going to wait it out, whatever it is. Now, those percentages you see are percentages of the total population. 8 to 10% of 320 or 330 million Quadrant B, that's a lot of people. Let's focus right now on Quadrant C. This is really the focus of the rest of my lecture. Those are patients that have normal hearing on the audiogram, but they report some type of hearing difficulty. Can't hear in background noise. I have to strain to hear certain accents, whatever it might be, usually a challenging situation. if you read Brent's paper, he talks about how Quadrant C is really amenable to an over-the-counter solution. And I don't disagree with him, but I do think that in a lot of clinics, and you that are currently seeing patients now, tell me if I'm wrong, you see people in Quadrant B fairly routinely. And there's estimations that between 8 and upwards of 20% of the population fall into Quadrant B. No measured hearing loss on the audiogram, but a self-reported hearing difficulty. And these have always been patients that I think have been kind of perplexing. It's like, what do we do with them? It's kind of off-putting for us, and it's, I'm guessing, very off-putting for the patients to say, you know, he's telling me my hearing is normal and there's not much I can do about it besides, you know, try to turn down the background noise. You know, that doesn't really help me very much. It's the people in Quadrant C that I would label many as having what we call subclinical hearing loss. Also notice that Quadrant B has a name. I put those people as contemplators, people that need to be moved into action. That is a different lecture, a different conversation. It's still an opportunity, but the focus today is on C, subclinical hearing loss. And we'll go into more details in a little bit about how I think you can manage those patients in the clinic. But before I do it, I want to talk about some of the really interesting convergences that are happening in technology that actually give you something to put into your intervention toolbox. To me, this is really exciting because it opens up a lot of opportunities for all the quadrants, but really for Quadrant C. When I talk about the convergence of technology, imagine a continuum, and on the left-hand side of the continuum, we have hearing aid technology. And of course, you're intimately familiar with it. But there's some interesting things inside of hearing aids that you don't find in any other type of audio device, like in the recording industry or in consumer audio earbuds and headphones. And you see some of those unique characteristics that are only found in the hearing aid world. Feedback cancellation, the ability to use machine learning or deep learning to reduce the occlusion effect. The ability to use wireless connections so that the two hearing aids, the two microphones in one hearing aid work together with the other to create a 4-microphone beamformer. And the ability to customize the ear mold so the plumbing fits correctly into the patient's ear. It's comfortable, secure, and it provides the right amount of acoustic gain and output. On the other end of the continuum, though, there are some characteristics in the consumer audio world, you know, think earbuds, think headphones, everybody wears them these days, that are really unique. And you see some of those things listed here. Bluetooth streaming has been in those devices for a number of years now. Smartphone enabled apps, remote rechargeability, audiophile sound quality, and the last one, which I'll emphasize today, I call fashion forward design. You know, something that looks like what a 25-year-old hipster in New York in the subway might use. And the convergence of these two different audio categories, they come together on this continuum somewhere in the middle, and we're seeing the creation of what I would call multitasking hybrid devices. And by my definition, all modern hearing aids are multitasking devices. They're just a little bit more like a hearing aid and a little bit less like a consumer audio product. By definition, a hybrid device has a core function and it has several secondary functions. The core function could be streaming music, and the secondary function might be talking on the phone, some situational amplification in certain areas, certain places, and maybe even biometrics, measuring heart rate, caloric intake, things like that, number of steps taken. And for one person, the core function might be amplification, whereas for the other person, the core function might be music streaming or talking on the phone. It varies from person to person. And now we're starting to see, now looking at just some examples, on one end of the left end of the continuum, we have devices. These are all really hybrid products. One's more like a hearing aid. On the far right, we have a product with, some really low end amplification in it that is a PSAP. And now in the middle, we have the emergence of these products that are more customizable in the way they amplify sounds, but also, have this fashion forward design. And they allow you to multitask in a very easy kind of a way. So think hybrid devices and think multitasking, and think about how all of these can have a place in your intervention toolbox. Now, we hear an awful lot of talk about PSAPs, over the counter, direct to consumer. That's definitely something that's happening, especially I think probably because of the pandemic. It's ramped up real fast over the last year. And the Consumer Technology Association, which is the group that sponsors the CES meeting in Las Vegas every year, they recognize earbuds as a huge business opportunity, especially relatives to hearing aids and earphones. And here's some data that I pulled from the CTA, just showing you over the next few years how they expect the growth of earbuds to really ramp up rather quickly, especially relative to hearing aids and headphones. Now, don't be thinking, these companies see an opportunity in that quadrant C. Those people with normal hearing on the audiogram and some self-reported difficulty. Why not put an amplifier inside inside their earbud? It's happening. It's probably going to continue to happen, but I'm going to argue there's a place for this kind of an earbud hybrid product in a clinic where a licensed professional is helping the patient navigate the choice of what they're going to use, and then helping them customize that product in their ear, that it's worth the patient's time and it's worth their money to get a device that maybe looks like an earbud, but it's fitted by a licensed professional. I think that that's a huge business opportunity. But don't fool yourself into thinking in the open market that there's a lot of companies out there that are vying for that business. There's an awful lot of money being invested into over-the-counter amplifiers. And not only over-the-counter amplifiers, but also into telehealth and those kind of devices being delivered remotely. Lively is a company that's been getting a lot of traction in the business press. They have an awful lot of capital that's been invested into that remote hearing care company. Then you see some PSAPs here and how much money has been invested in those. When the regulations change, some of these products will probably be considered over-the-counter hearing aids. Anyway, I want to focus the rest of the time on quadrant C and how having a hybrid device, that one that I showed you in the middle of the continuum, is a really handy device to have in your intervention toolbox when it comes to people that are in quadrant C. And also be thinking about how you could use that hybrid device that's in the middle of my continuum, how that might also apply to people in quadrant B, people that have self-reported difficulty and a measured hearing loss, but are resistant for some way. Maybe a device that's more fashion forward would speed the journey towards acceptance. If it's a full-fledged hearing aid, why couldn't they just wear that all the time, and they're going to get a lot of benefit from it? So primarily think about quadrant C as the best case, but also think about how you could speed the journey for those that are in quadrant B. They have that moderate hearing loss, and they're saying, why should I do something now? It's not that big of a deal. I can wait. But we'll focus on quadrant C. Now, what I want you to be thinking about here, like I said, in my years in the clinic, I think you saw these patients, a few a month. Maybe more sometimes. These people come in, healthy looking, maybe a middle-aged adult, very active, and they're complaining, I'm just not hearing in noise. When I go to restaurants, when I go to social situations, I really have to struggle to hear, and it's becoming bothersome, and I want to do something about it. And I can think back, how many times did you take a case history on somebody like this and you're thinking this person probably has a fairly substantial hearing loss, and then when you get them out of but then you start testing them, you realize the loss isn't really existing. And you say something like this, the test shows you have normal hearing. Now, I think it's not only disconcerting and off-putting for us, as I said before, but I think it's off-putting for the individual that comes in seeking your help to be told that it's normal. Now, maybe it's reassuring, but at the same time, I'm sure these patients are wondering, what can I do? This problem is still bothering me, and they're telling me it's normal. Um, that kind of speaks to how that audiogram, which has been around for about 100 years, has some really serious shortcomings and is not the only tool that we really need to define somebody's condition. And in my opinion, it's better to say this that you see on the slide than nothing at all. But how often is it enough to say, uh, you know, I'm sorry, Mrs. Smith, your hearing is normal on paper, and maybe you put normal in quotations. We'll see you back in a year. You're really not a hearing aid candidate, and maybe use these communication strategies: face the speaker, minimize the noise, stay off of hardwood floors. You know the shtick. I don't have to tell you. And this is kind of the only thing we've been able to say to these folks, because it's really not, a pair of $4,000 hearing aids to fix this kind of an issue is not really feasible in a lot of cases. Anyway, we actually have a name for this now. It's called subclinical hearing loss. And here's an example of it right here. Some of the thresholds are right at a little bit below the normal range, but when you sum up the pure tone average at 5, 1, and 2, the pure tone average is 20, better than 20 or 25. So let's explore in a little bit more detail what subclinical hearing loss is, and maybe talk a little bit about what are some of the findings around it. I find it really kind of interesting. So number one, there's not really an official definition of subclinical hearing loss. Some people consider it pure tone average better than 20 dBHL, others say 25. The prevalence is another issue. I showed you in the slide before, Edwards in his review, I think he said it was between 8 and over 20%, depending on a half dozen studies. The two better studies that more carefully defined hearing loss are listed here. Kelly Tremblay, who used to be up in your neck of the woods at the University of Washington, did a study that looked at this issue and found that and estimated based on her work that 12% of adults that had normal audiograms had some self-reported hearing difficulties. And another study similar to that, Chris Spankovich, who believes at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, found a very similar number. About 15% of adults had normal audiograms and self-reported hearing difficulties. Now that 12% and 15%, that's of adults. That's people, that's the entire population. That's a really big number. Again, it shows you this problem is kind of these people have fallen through the cracks, flown under the radar, but it also speaks to how the audiogram is probably not a very good tool for detecting certain conditions. It's an older tool. It might be good diagnostically for medical problems, but it's not a good tool that kind of helps us carefully assess somebody's functional day-to-day communication ability. A couple other things that are on this slide that are really interesting, and hopefully there's more work being done in this area. But thanks to an otologist in New York City at Columbia University, Justin Golub, we found that, and I think it's safe to say, based on his work, that subclinical hearing loss is not a benign condition. He showed in a study published last year that there's a link between subclinical hearing loss, low normal, let's say, on the audiogram, and cognitive decline. People that were considered to have normal hearing on the audiogram still were showing some signs of cognitive decline. on the low end of normal, but normal range nonetheless. So it just shows you that the cognition and hearing link maybe starts earlier than we think, and the audiogram is not the most sensitive tool to see that, uncover that linkage. He also did a study that looked at subclinical hearing loss and depressive symptoms, and the same thing was apparent. People that had subclinical hearing loss were more likely to have depressive symptoms. People on the low end of normal more likely to have depressive symptoms than people on the high end of the normal range. The audiogram, what's at about a 30 dB range there that we consider normal, from -10 to 20. Another thing that's important to consider is, in addition to hearing this term subclinical hearing loss, you also hear the term hidden hearing loss. And they are kind of interchangeable to a certain extent. And I'll just kind of share with you how I think of these two terms. I think of hidden hearing loss as more narrowly defined and more synonymous with some type of dysfunction that can be measured with electrophysiology. The term that some people use for hidden hearing loss is cochlear synaptopathy. Also, central auditory processing, I think, would have a role in hidden hearing loss. And it's cochlear synaptopathy is actually a disconnect between the ear and the brain that can be measured with electrophysiology. And I think, if you had a child or a young adult that had some very specific signs, you might want to refer and have some of that electrophysiologic test done to rule out hidden hearing loss. But there's still a lot of research to be done in that area, still a lot of a lot of questions to be answered. And the reason I use subclinical hearing loss as a term is because it's more broadly defines it, I think. And it's really a functional description. And our job as hearing care professionals is, once we are comfortable ruling out a medical pathology or making the referral, we still have to work with these patients that have these subclinical hearing losses and have some very specific functional complaints. So we'll leave hidden hearing loss to the scientists and know that it's a more narrowly defined term. And in the clinic, I think it's better to stick with that term, subclinical hearing loss. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about, if we're going to take the time to define subclinical hearing loss, if we're going to take the time to have something in our intervention toolbox, these hybrid devices, let's talk about why intervention might be, early intervention might be something to take into consideration. And what I want to just look at here very briefly is this linkage between hearing loss and cognitive decline. I think most of you have heard multiple times about this landmark study from the Johns Hopkins group that looked at very carefully the relationship between degree of hearing loss and risk of dementia. And they found what I would call a dosage effect, meaning the more hearing loss that's present, the more of an increased risk of acquiring dementia. And it's pretty interesting. A person with an untreated severe hearing loss is at 5-fold the risk of somebody with normal hearing. Somebody with a mild hearing loss is 2-fold or 100% increased risk. And as I mentioned before, this linkage seems to be present earlier than we thought relative to that Golub study. People on the low end of normal are showing some early signs of cognitive decline. This is all an argument for why it's important to put hearing aids on somebody sooner rather than later. And if we take a closer look at that, we know, based on some work that was done in the UK, published in the British journal The Lancet, that 35% of the risk factors associated with acquiring dementia, 35% are modifiable, meaning that if you intervene at a younger age with whatever treatment or therapy or lifestyle change, you have a chance of minimizing or lowering the risk of acquiring dementia. And 65% of the risk factors related to acquiring dementia are non-modifiable. They're genetic. They're baked into the person's DNA, and they can't be changed. But what's really interesting, 35% is a pretty big number, and hearing loss accounts for 9% of that 35%, so about almost a third of the modifiable risk factors can be changed with some, at least in theory, with early intervention. You see in midlife there, hearing loss, that's when it becomes an issue. That's why it's important, I think, to have some of these devices, because if somebody's more apt to use it when they're younger, middle-aged, have a milder or even subclinical hearing loss, that's going to prevent or at least lower the risk of acquiring a condition like dementia. That dosage effect holds true for some other conditions as well, but we don't have time to get into them. I thought it was interesting. I wanted to share with you a couple of different theories about how hearing aids might help reduce the risk of acquiring dementia. One of those theories is called cascade, or the use it or lose it theory. And you can kind of see it nicely on this slide, how having a hearing loss causes changes both in the structure and the function of the cortex of the brain. And of course, that leads to cognitive impairment. That's what those red boxes are showing us. In parallel to that, a hearing loss also causes, in many cases, a person to stop socializing as much, to stop talking as much, and that leads to social isolation, even depression, and that's also tied to cognitive impairment. And of course, use it or lose it can be averted with the use of hearing aids, as you see now on the right-hand side of the slide. In theory, putting a hearing aid on somebody is essentially that X there. It stops that cascading effect. When you talk about neuroplasticity, that's really the cascade theory, use it or lose it in effect. The other theory that's important to know is called cognitive load. You hear about this one as well, and how hearing aids can help. And you can think of those little round red circles as all of your cognitive resources. And if you're ever having to do multitasking, like people do on a regular basis, like pay attention to what somebody is saying and then write it down and make sure that you're remembering it, that task becomes very difficult when you have a hearing loss, because you have to divert more of your cognitive resources into listening and less into working memory. And that's when listening becomes more effortful. That's when people say they're tired at the end of the day because they've had to listen so hard. And of course, hearing aids, as you see now on the right-hand side of the slide, they avert that by, keeping the cognitive resources available for both those tasks. And in theory, that's how it works. And there's a few studies out there that are showing that, yes, that happens. But right now, the data is kind of mixed. But I think it's a good bet to say, hearing aids are not going to do any harm. And there's all kinds of potential to slow down the decline of cognition as people age. Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent on some of those theories and why it's important to intervene early. It's not just about helping people hear better and communicate more effectively. It's about, maintaining good cognitive health. And of course, the sooner we do that in middle age, rather than waiting until somebody's in their 70s and 80s, the better off they're likely to be. Let's talk about, and let's kind of bring this back into the clinic realm and talk about what some of these things might look like in the clinic. I want to paint a little picture for you, and I want you to be thinking about how you can do some things differently in the clinic based on what we've talked about so far around the concepts of subclinical hearing loss and hybrid devices. There's a little bit of data kind of indirectly that speaks to the number of people out there that have subclinical hearing loss that might be seeking your services. I'm referring to a paper that Larry Humes wrote in the Hearing Review last summer as part of his OTC studies that were published a few years ago. They did some local advertising to bring people in to be subjects for his study. And when they did this advertising in the local Indiana University newspaper, when they were looking to see who might qualify for the study, they found that about 20% of those coming in for their consultation to be part of the research would fall into that subclinical hearing loss category, that they had normal audiograms. But they came in obviously because, they thought, they saw the ad and say, oh, they have an ad, they have this hearing aid, maybe it'll help me. So you kind of indirectly can see from that study that about 20% of people coming in off the ad had normal hearing. So my recommendation to you would be two things. In addition to doing routine pure tone testing and realizing that it's something that we need to do, but it's not the best tool in the world to identify this population, I would do two other things. I would conduct speech and noise testing, and I think the preference there is the QuickSyn, and I'm guessing most of you are familiar with that test and have it on your audiometer. So if you're not using it, I would, because you'll find if you start using it routinely, there are a lot of people out there with subclinical hearing loss on the audiogram, but have some difficulty in background noise. And the other thing I would urge you and encourage you to do is start doing some type of a functional communication assessment, which means quantify somebody's self-reported hearing difficulty. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that. But the tool that I think has the most value is what you see here. It's called the Hearing Handicap Inventory, abbreviated version for adults, the HHIA. I think most of you have seen this. I'm guessing some of you use this, but I would use this routinely with all of my patients, but it is particularly helpful for people with that are in that subclinical category, because it helps you find and quantify their self-reported hearing difficulty. And the two questions on this that seem to be the best predictors of who has self-reported hearing difficulties are questions 8 and questions 10. So if you really wanted to have the budget version of this to save time, you could probably just go down to those two questions 8 and 10 and use those. And if somebody's answering a yes to one of those questions and they still have normal audiograms, I would still consider them a candidate for some type of device intervention. Now look at question 8 is difficulty with listening to the TV and the radio. You could probably add TV, radio, and podcasts or something like that. And does your hearing problem cause you difficulty when you're in a restaurant with relatives or friends? Now, some people may have to, think back a year to answer that question, but I think you get a pretty solid answer from everybody. And again, the teaching point here is if somebody has a normal audiogram and they answer that question as a yes, on question 8 or 10, I would still consider that person a candidate for some type of device intervention. I would at least have that exploratory conversation. Now, to me, this is one of the most interesting things I'm going to share with you. This comes from that Humes paper that I referenced a few minutes ago. This is easy to find. It was published in the Hearing Review last July, I think. Now, remember I said, they brought all these people in to be part of the study, and 20% of the people they saw didn't qualify for the study because they had normal audiograms. But because they were there, you can say that they had self-reported hearing difficulty. Anyway, what this slide is showing you is how much self-reported hearing difficulty they had on the research version of this tool. This is the clinical version. It's only 10 questions. In the research that they did, they used the 25 question version. And what they found is, and now you'll see here two different groups, but what I want you to pay attention to are just the three bars for normal, mild, and moderate. The people in the normal group, many of them have either subclinical hearing loss or maybe mild, like a 30 dB pure tone average. Notice they're unaided in the dark bar, the darkest of the bars, where their number is. Look at the normal group compared to those that have mild and moderate hearing loss. The darkest bar in the unaided condition is essentially the same for people that have normal audiograms versus those that have mild and moderate, which tells you that the audiogram is a very poor tool for assessing somebody's functional communication ability. And a tool like the HHIE helps uncover. I mean, look, think about that. People with normal audiograms had the same level of self-reported difficulty on average as people with mild and moderate. That's really interesting. And even more interesting, or just as interesting, as is that people with normal hearing on the audiogram received the same amount of aided benefit. Notice how the other two, the lighter of the two bars, like the two gray, dark gray and light gray, look at the dark gray. That's the difference between the unaided and the aided. The normal hearing group is experiencing or is receiving the same amount of benefit essentially as those with mild and moderate losses. That's really interesting. It just shows you that an intervention can be effective on somebody with normal or near normal audiograms, subclinical hearing loss, let's say, and self-reported hearing difficulty. In other words, don't be shy about talking about device interventions with people that have subclinical hearing loss. I think they're great candidates, at least for an exploratory conversation around devices like this. I have to put a plug in for the Signia devices. This is really the only device on the market right now that's a fully featured, customizable hearing device that's disguised as an earbud. When I say customizable, I mean it's got all the bells and whistles of a full conventional hearing aid. It's got the sleeves, of course, that makes the fitting non-customizable, but I can tell you from my own experience that this fits just like a pair of AirPods does. It's got all the bells and whistles of the latest hearing aids in it. It's easy to fit off the shelf. It's rechargeable. So it has, a fashion forward design. It has rechargeability. And it's something that I would strongly encourage you to put in your intervention toolbox. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here and just remind everybody that people with this condition, subclinical hearing loss, is an underserved and underserviced population. But by adding a couple wrinkles to your clinic repertoire, namely using the HHIA, the abbreviated version of it, you can start uncovering and quantifying some of the difficulties that they're having, and then having that conversation around, is it feasible for the patients and that fall into this category to use some type of a hybrid device, that incorporates technology from hearing aids and incorporates fashion forward design and technology from the consumer audio world. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up